So I'm going to turn it over to you and you can take it away.
All right. So hello and welcome back from lunch. My name is Sarah Holsted and I am the Hospital Library Services Program Manager at Southeastern. I'd like to thank Carolyn and the CE Committee for giving me the opportunity to present today. I'll try to strike a balance between doom and gloom and exciting as I talk about disaster planning for libraries. My presentation has two parts. I'll use the first couple of slides to recap information from the Resilient Workshop series that Southeastern organized this past year on helping libraries prepare for disasters. The remainder of the presentation, I'll talk you through 7-ish questions that you can use today to start creating a disaster plan for your library. I'm going to make a lot of references to resources and the project website. The URL is on the title slide, and I already dropped it into the chat. I've also dropped a link to the continuity of operations plan document that I'll reference in the second part of my presentation. I'll drop these a couple of more times into the chat in case people come in late. So let's get started. The Resilient Workshop series is funded with a Health Information Outreach Award from the National Library of Medicine, and I'd like to acknowledge their support. The grant number is in the fine print on this slide. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material do not necessarily reflect the view of the National Library of Medicine or the National Institutes of Health. So about this time last year, or 1,000 years ago, we were working on the grant proposal to NLM. And it ends on April 30th, or 1,000 years from now. So I'd like to shamelessly promote the last two events in the series. Our final workshop happens on Monday, and it's on Zoom, and it's free. The workshop is Planning for Recovery After a Library Disaster, and it's going to be a panel presentation from 3 library directors who lost it all and built or are building it back better. So please join Carol McCrossan, Elizabeth Potter, and Daniela Polisi, who are from the Mid-Hudson and the Ramapo Catskill library systems as they tell their library stories and provide a lot of practical information about recovering from major disasters in their libraries. So the only thing more that I will say about this is, when was the last time that you reviewed your insurance policy? So also I'll invite you to please join the Disaster Planning Working Group in 2 weeks. This is an informal meeting where we share progress on developing our respective disaster plans. I suggest you start answering the 7-ish questions later in the presentation, and then come to the working group to get some support and to learn about next steps. You can register for both free events at the project website. While you're there, you'll find recordings of the previous workshops listed on this slide and a plethora of worksheets and checklists and information resources for libraries and for your communities. I've included a few of those resources on the last slide of this presentation. So we started planning for these workshops back in February 2020 in response to events that we saw happening at libraries in the Southeastern region. This was not a response to the pandemic. But as we've seen over the past year, natural disasters haven't been put on hold for the pandemic. And even without major weather events, closing and reopening libraries in the middle of a pandemic brings whole other layers of stress. The way we experience emergencies or disasters or daily pandemic life is deeply personal, and the trauma is life-altering. I just want to acknowledge the experiences that you all may be bringing to this workshop and ask that as speakers or commenters and listeners, we respect the narratives that may be shared today. So our first speaker at the first workshop was Michelle Stricker from the New Jersey State Library, and she shared what has become a theme for these workshops, and that is resilient libraries, including staff and the facility, support and are a foundation for resilient communities, and resilient communities can recover more quickly from disasters. So when we wrote the proposal, the word resilient seemed appropriate, and now it's just trendy. So I'd like to step back and share the definition of resilience that was provided by Dr. Amy Nitza and Dr. Carla Vermeulen during their workshop on self-care and self-defense and de-escalation. So they say resilience is being able to stay in or quickly return to a place of physiological, emotional, and mental balance after being disrupted. maintaining the ability to respond versus react to difficult situations. So I'd invite you to watch their entire presentation. It is still so entirely relevant. And the website includes worksheets for library staff to create self-care plans. So the image that we're looking at on this slide is a preparedness cycle from workshop number 3, which was presented by Tim Hayes from Central Hudson on planning for extended electrical outages. There are many images similar to this one online, and some of them have steps like plan, respond, recover, evaluate. The focus of these workshops has been on planning and less on the other phases. So I'll acknowledge the tips on this slide are really big picture. And I want to emphasize that there is no expectation whatsoever that library staff are or become first responders. When the building is on fire, you evacuate with everyone else. What I'm saying is that library staff can learn about the jobs of first responders, learn the incident command system, which is the language of first responders, so that you better know how to interface with them. This slide is also focused on being prepared for disasters that are external to the library, that happen to your community or your region. In these cases, your communities will turn to the library as a safe space, as a trusted source for information. You can be ready for that by making a plan. So it can be 1 page, or it can be 398 pages, like the one from Central Hudson about how they respond to electrical outages. But wait, you say, you've already made a plan? Well, so I would ask, when was the last time you updated it? And you're like, oh, you've updated your plan like every month of the pandemic? Well, so when was the last time your staff ran through your plan? And so that brings me to the next slide. So this slide has images from various workshop presentations. The first one, it's to my left on my screen, and there's a girl sleeping peacefully. And she's dreaming about her family and everybody's safe. And she's saying, there's no need to be scared when you're prepared, which is a phrase that I found handy many times. But also hint, hint, September is disaster preparedness month, but April will do just as well now that we're headed into summer with summer storms. The slide demonstrating empathy with the kind bear and the kind but stressed out fox at the bottom of a well is from the workshop on self-care. The presenters reminded us that empathy is understanding or feeling what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference, not trying to tell another person what they're feeling or trying to minimize their feelings. And finally, the picture on the bottom of bold is from the 5th workshop by Bex Caswell-Olson from NEDCC. She took a deep dive into the science of mold, including identifying it, which you see here. And so a couple of her tips are: active mold will appear hairy or fuzzy, and it will feel wet and smear when touched, as if. Mold can spread quickly, and it is a hazard to library collections as well as human health. So handle it with caution. And mold spreads quickly, so check nearby items for signs of mold. Wash your hands and wipe down your surfaces after handling moldy items. Bex also had a lot of information about personal protective equipment and how to deal with mold in your collections. And just a couple of more data points. Mold is in the air all around us all the time, and that's usually not a problem. The amount of mold in the air will depend on the time of year and your geographic location. The interesting part is that there are no federal standards that dictate what constitutes safe or unsafe levels of mold in the air, and different people have different tolerances. However, OSHA does regulate how mold should be treated in the workplace and what protections employer must provide. So this concludes the highlights tour of the Resilient Workshop series. There's so much more to learn, so please check out the website. And I want to thank the presenters who shared their time and expertise with us. So now I'd like to transition to the hands-on part of the presentation. I'm going to pause and I'm going to drop into the chat the link of the project website and the coup plan document that we're going to reference a little bit later. And then I'm going to pause for a sip of water. All right, so I dropped the link. Okay. So during the past year, the Disaster Planning Working Group used a risk assessment sheet to identify the hazards that might affect their libraries and then determine the probability of the event happening and its impact on the library. So of the list of hazards developed by New York State, Pandemic is number 13 on the list. And I would invite you to drop your guesses into the chat. What do you think is the last hazard on the list? So what's the hazard that's least likely to occur in New York State? And kitten storm is not an answer. So I will say that the answer is volcano. You can be very typhoon. No, so volcano. And so you can cross that one off your list of worries. The Spanish Inquisition did not make the list, but Monty Python makes a good foil for what we're talking about. So we're going to focus on the continuity of operations plan now. But if you did all of these things on this list, the self-care planner, having plans in print and in the cloud, having a mutual aid agreement with another library, and providing resources for your community to make their own disaster plans. If you did all of that, your library and your community would be prepared with a capital P until the next big event. And so that's one thing I'd like to emphasize also, is that anything you can do to be prepared is good. And whatever you do will not be perfect. So don't beat yourself up trying to make it perfect. But you should just make a start. That's my point. So the one workshop presenter that I haven't name checked yet is Dan Wilson. And so he led workshop 4 on creating continuity of operations plans. He's also developed a free online course for the National Library of Medicine about creating these plans. And I have a link to that on the last slide. The image on this page is unreadable, and it's almost unreadable at full size. This is the first page of the one-page COOP plan. It's a place to start, and it's easier to update than a binder. So here we go. These are the 7-ish questions. I didn't count the ones that are in smaller print. But Southeastern is working on its own COOP plan. And so to fill in the blanks on that document that I just showed you, I turn those columns into a series of questions. And so if you answer these, then you can complete the plan. And so just talking through them kind of quickly, if the pandemic has been good for anything, it is that we have all been laser focused on questions 1 and 2. So what are the essential services to be maintained and who will be responsible for them? And then who are the groups that need to know about these essential services? And so for question number 2, that gets into your communications plan. How do you reach the groups that need to know about your essential services? The COOP plan includes a place where you can actually write down voicemail messages that you need to broadcast. How does your community reach you in a disaster? And what are the messages that you want to convey to them? Question number 3, what support staff resources need to be activated? This is actually not a part of the COOP plan template provided by Dan Wilson, but we talked and he agreed that it's really important. And so I would refer you again to those self-care planner checklists from workshop number 2. So question number 4, who's on the decision-making team? This is actually one of the first pieces of information on that COOP plan template, but it's going to take you a while to arrive at your essential services before you can decide who should be the people making the decisions, and they'll help coordinate the response. The number 1 person and number 1 piece of information on that plan is who's the emergency response coordinator. This is the person who's going to call it. They're going to say, we're going to activate this plan. Questions 6 and 7 have to do with, if you have physical materials, if something bad happens to your building, what do you prioritize for rescue? And if your building is unusable, what needs to be moved off-site? So there's some bonus questions here. I want to make some observations about Southeastern's experience. The sample plan that you might have just opened is for a large health sciences library. When it comes time to fill in the blanks, smaller organizations might think about roles for people instead of the titles of departments or units. The beauty of the COOP plan is that it scales up and down to fit the size of the organization. So these are some more resources that I mentioned, resources for libraries, resources for communities. And again, I would like to highlight the next steps. Please come to the next workshop. Please come to the disaster planning webinar. And I want to wrap up again with my theme: resilient libraries, including staff and facilities, help support resilient communities by serving as a safe space and a trusted source of information, and can help communities better recover from a disaster. So thank you very much. I think I've hit my time. Oh, we actually have time for questions. So I will take any questions that people have. And again, thank you. Okay, so there's a question for Amy, and you from the BART archives, and you found the disaster workshop very helpful. Thanks, Amy. Yes, so the disaster planning working group really is like, I just threw a bunch of questions at you in the COOP plan document, and it's a lot to grok. And this would be the disaster planning working group is a good place to come and kind of thrash things out and figure out how this would work for your library. All right, so I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'll stick around for a minute to take questions, but I know you've got an agenda, Carolyn, so.
Well, next up on my agenda is a round of applause for Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
That's great. Anita has a question for you.
All right, Anita asks, have you found that board members have been actively involved in disaster planning, or has it mostly fallen to internal library personnel? So that's a really good question. And Dan Wilson from workshop number 4 said, if you want to get the process started, find the person on your staff who is most committed to this and let them run with it as far as they can before you start involving your board or internal library personnel. So find your champion. I think at some point, again, the COOP plan is just one. It's like the tip of the iceberg, and it really does eventually touch on, you might be missing some policies, you might be missing some procedures. So at some point, you probably will have to involve your board. At Elting Library, where I also serve on the board, I'm trying to get the facilities committee to kind of take ownership for disaster planning, and eventually they'll kick it to the board. So I hope that answered your question. All right, thanks you guys.